So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, almost every solar system sold in California and also in Hawaii includes a battery. I call it the Reese's peanut butter phenomenon taken to the extreme. Imagine if there were no market for just a chocolate bar or a peanut bar. You can only get them combined in a delicious, chocolatey, nutty confection. Well, that's kind of the way solar and batteries are in California and Hawaii. There's a negligible market in California for just solar. Almost everybody who's putting in a new solar system puts in a battery. It's more expensive, but you kind of need to do it to make the economics pencil out. And then we're also adding batteries for a lot of people. But for a new system, it only makes sense when they're combined. That's why over 80% of the systems sold in California right now, I think, are with batteries, and our attachment right here in Cinnamon Energy is close to 100%. So there's three reasons why solar and batteries are a match made in heaven, and it was actually a match made by the California Public Utilities Commission. First, the end of net metering means that there's no financial benefits to sending the excess daytime power back to the utility. They hardly reimburse you at all. It's like zero sometimes. And they take this energy and they don't pay you for it. So it's like they're giving them free energy. And you know what? I don't have a lot of altruism towards my local utility, and it kind of grates on me. The second is you can store excess daytime power in a battery and avoid sky-high electric rates. Our electric rates here in San Jose peak at 64 cents a kilowatt hour. I think it's closer to 80 down in San Diego. And third, there's so many blackouts that people need to invest in their own power system because the utility power is unreliable. And you know, we're in the middle of a terrible wildfire situation now going on in Southern California because of high winds, and the utilities turning off the power to minimize problems. But the battery systems are much more complicated than a straightforward solar system. And you have to understand what a homeowner's and a customer's backup power needs, how much power you need, how long you want to back things up. And you need to understand the limitations of these systems in terms of kilowatts and kilowatt hours. And it's not easy to put these things in. I mean, basically, with a rooftop solar system, you can kind of look at an aerial photo and say, this is how many solar panels fit. But when you want to put batteries in a house or around the side of a house, you really got to be careful about where they're sited because there's so many constraints and rules. So my guest this week is an expert in these topics. His name's Greg Smith, and he's one of the industry's foremost battery experts. He's got a track record at leading companies such as SMA, Sun, and Intigo. And he's the author of The Battery-Powered Home, subtitled The Foolproof Grid-Tied Lithium Storage. It's an Amazon bestseller, believe it or not. And it's even outselling the Uglies Electrical Reference. I'm not making this stuff up. And Woodworking for Dummies, and probably the National Electric Code. And I'm a little bummed out today because Greg was going to be here in the studio and I was going to get an autograph copy. But we'll have to, arrange for that another time. So welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you so much, Barry. It's been a long time coming, and I'm just so stoked. And I'm sorry I couldn't be in San Jose. I got too much family stuff going on, but I will get out there at some point or see at one of the shows. We always run into each other, and I'll sign that book.
All right. We're just a few miles down the road from Taiga. Yep. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your background and what you're doing as the Global Director of Learning at Taiga.
I know the title sounds much fancier than it really is. But I've been at Taiga, it'll be 4 years come this April. And I'm responsible for, foremost, training our internal support team. So I work very closely with them. And then kind of a secondary thing is training the rest of the industry. So I've created an online platform, a learning management system. I have a lot of courses up there, multiple different languages. And so, I've been in this industry since 2008, and I've always been in a training capacity. So I'm always trying to figure out new ways to train the masses, and always worked for manufacturer, right? And so all the manufacturers have different requirements for installing their equipment and commissioning. So that takes up the bulk of my time as well.
All right. I mean, Tygo's one of those pioneering companies, and you've got a terrific background. So, and that's kind of what people need, because it's not an immediate thing. It takes time to learn about all these details going back in history. But let's talk a little bit about the terminology that people need to know and understand, whether you're a homeowner or an installer, regarding a battery system, how it's designed, the kilowatt hours, the kilowatts, peak, steady state, compatibility, things like that. What are the key things that people need to know in order to interpret specs?
Yeah, that is a great question. And thank you for plugging my book. I do appreciate that. It was a labor of love, let me tell you. And I wrote it during COVID when my travel went from 50% to zero, and I was going out of my mind. So one of the very first things that I talk about in that book is terms and terminology, because it's so important that everybody is on the same page and that we're all speaking the same language, because there's a lot of slang in our industry. You got guys that been in way longer than me that use a lot of terms that may not even be compatible with today's technology. Yeah. So you touched on the first one that I like to talk about, and that's the difference between kilowatt hour and kilowatt. And in my book, glossaries are not the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's kind of, it's required. And I get a lot of people now, even now, that will say something like, oh man, I got a 30 kilowatt battery system. I'm like, holy smokes, man. Like, what are you powering with that? And what they really meant to say was, I got a 30 kilowatt hour system. They're talking about the energy storage, not the actual power of the inverter output. So that's a common one.
What are some of the electrical constraints when designing a battery system?
Wow, that is another great question. So the first thing there are several. Okay, there's the capacity of the main service entrance or the panel. There's circuit breaker limitations, wiring sizes. One of the things I always harp on is load management. And it's one of the things that people just kind of gloss over, right? There is no way that you can effectively design an energy storage system if you don't even know what the customer wants to back up or what their load profile is, like how many kilowatt hours a day do they consume, because there are many different operating modes, which we can get into later, and each one requires a specific kind of design. But when the grid goes out, almost all modern energy storage systems will revert to a backup mode, which means whatever's on that AC panel is now at the mercy of the limits of the energy storage system. Yeah. Battery placement, spacing requirements. Like if you got a garage like mine, my old Sonnen system actually used to be on the wall behind me. And, that was an easy place to put it. But, we have all these other codes and regulations and restrictions. Matter of fact, the restrictions may even come down to a specific area in the city or county that you're in, where they may allow or disallow energy storage in a specific area. So then you'd have to find out, where, on the structure you can install the batteries. Temperature considerations. I'm getting a lot of questions now from people in the Northeast, right? It's getting cold and they've got energy storage systems that are outside. They are not protected in an enclosure. And so that offers a different, kind of design considerations than somebody that calls me from, Phoenix, right? Where they have to worry about 120 degree, outside temperatures. So there's a lot of things out there to look at. There's a lot of things to kind of sift through, but fortunately there's a lot of resources as well.
So the one that I think hits us often, and there's misinformation put out by manufacturers in their enthusiasm to sell systems, and that is really related to the load management, related to how effectively your battery system will work when there's a blackout. And I have a 6-year-old storage system from SolarEdge on my house. It's got a 5 kilowatt maximum capacity. And so I set it up with what's called an essential load panel, where I only have my essential loads in the house connected to that. So I never go over the 5 kilowatt limit. I got the fridge, I got the cable modem, the entertainment system, a bunch of lights, the garage door opener, the coffee maker, the essentials of life. And a lot of the manufacturers, even when they have battery systems only have a 5 kilowatt capacity, they're saying you can power your whole house, or if you need more power, get 2 batteries. You got a total of 10 kilowatts. But I look at a typical house, and if I'm trying to power my heat pump or my pool pumps or my EV charger, plus a few other things in the house, I'm easily going to be over that 5 or 10 kilowatt range, and the system's just not going to turn on. And so our focus, what I think, in our company, but also the way I think installers should look at this is you want to understand what the demand is in the house and during a blackout, and explain to the customer what's going to happen when there's a blackout if they try and power the whole house. I mean, some systems out there can do 10 or 15 kilowatts. That sounds great. So you have enough capacity. But then the next question is how much energy, how much kilowatt hour capacity is in there? And once again, you run into a situation where if you power these big loads, you're going to run out of power. So what's your advice to homeowners and installers to maximize the satisfaction when people buy a system?
Yeah, it all boils down to, and it may sound cliche, but it boils down to, first of all, integrity and knowing the system capabilities, right? So when I hear a manufacturer state that, oh, 1 battery will power an entire house, that may be true. However, they may only be able to power that house for about 10 minutes, depending on what your loads are, right? So it's disingenuous for them to say that, right? Because powering a house in, here in the Valley, Central Valley where I am, is much different than powering a house somewhere else, right? And the major contributor to loads, at least in the summertime, is air conditioning. And there are not a lot of energy storage systems out there that would even be able to turn on something like that, right? There's too much surge power. And what most modern energy storage systems would do is they would just shut down. Like they would give as much power as they can for whatever stated amount of time the manufacturer says, and then it just shuts off. And it could go either the system shuts down, but is still awake, or it turns completely off and then require homeowner intervention to go out there and turn the thing on. So there's different levels of pain associated with not understanding what the systems can do.
Yeah. We have a lot of customers who insist on saying, well, I'm going to manage my loads. If there's a blackout, I will make sure I turn things off. And the anecdote that I always go to is, one customer said he was going to do this. And, they had a typical house here in Silicon Valley. And there was a blackout at night and their air conditioner was running. And obviously he was sleeping. And his CPAP machine was backed up as long as the backup system was running. But as soon as that air conditioner drained all the energy, all the kilowatt hours in that battery, his CPAP machine went off. He started snoring. His wife kicked him out of bed and he had to sleep on the couch and, the lights were off. So the solution to that is making sure you have an essential load panel where you're running just what you really need. In his case, a CPAP machine and a few other things. But yeah, it does kind of irk me when I see manufacturers just saying, hey, 1 battery is good, but just get 2 and then you'll be fine. And the problem is with 2 batteries and maybe you have twice as much capacity, but you're still going to run out of juice when that air conditioner is running, without a doubt.
Absolutely. And I will tell you right now, and you know this to be true, Barry, homeowners will use every watt hour you give them. It doesn't matter how many batteries you give them, they will use all of it. So you have to temper their consumption, right? And the best way to do that, you hit on it, is to give them an essential load panel or a protected load panel, backup panel, whatever you want to call it. And I always do like the pick 6, right? Like the lottery, right? Pick 6. Pick 6 circuits in your home that you want to back up, because you're not really backing up loads. You're backing up the electrical wiring that feeds those loads, right? So you're backing up typically the kitchen, because that's got the refrigerator in it, and the microwave. And you generally, and essential loads means different thing to other people. Like when I was with Sonnen, there was a 3-month period, I don't know what was going on, where people were calling in wanting to know if we would be able to back up these, 1,000-gallon exotic fish tanks. And I researched those, and I was shocked at how much power those things consume, right? Walk-in humidors and, wine cellars, climate controlled, it was just crazy. But if you do an essential load panel and you pick 6, then you're basically forcing the customer as an installer to manage their consumption, right? So the battery system is not at the mercy of every little thing in that home.
Yeah, yeah. We do the same thing. I picked 6 and then I squeezed 2 more in. So then I picked 8, doubled up some breakers. And now basically when we talk to our designers and salespeople, we say, just have the customer pick 4. They're going to come up with 2 more and just give it to them. But once you get over, with my 8, I'm okay, but still, I got to watch it. All right. Well, we talked about the limitations, the energy limitations in kilowatt hours, the power limitations in kilowatts. What are some of the restrictions on where the batteries can be installed?
Ooh, that gets deep into a rabbit hole. And on the surface, it's pretty easy. Finding the information may be a little difficult, because there's a lot of stuff out there, right? You have the International Fire Code, the International Building Code, you've got UL, blah, 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 all these things, right? And so the installers have to know this. And then it comes down to, again, as far as the authority having jurisdiction, they can have their own interpretation of these codes or standards, and they can be even more restrictive. I tell people it's like states' rights, right? If that AHJ says, and I have one and it's here in California, if you have a battery system in your garage, you will put bollards around that thing, even though NFPA 855 says you don't need them if the battery system is not in the line of sight when you pull your car in the garage, right? So they could do whatever they want. So going into your question, there are some things like and I don't want to get too deep into this, but if you're going to install this thing in a garage inside a home, there are restrictions on how much capacity you can install. And so I tell people, and I think of it like this, what these things are doing, what these rules, regulations, standards, and codes are doing, are trying to mitigate when something goes wrong. That's what they're doing. Very few of them are there for customer advocacy. They're there in case the shit hits the fan. And then you don't want to burn down the entire house. You don't want to have this massive thermal runaway event. And so they put restrictions, right? So, okay, if you're going to put it in the house, well, then you can have, 20 kilowatt hour chunks and you can go up to this much. But if you want to put it outside, then you can go up to this much, right? So there's a lot of things like that. Matter of fact, there's even spacing requirements, right? If you have multiple batteries, depending on what they're rated for, they have to be 3 feet apart, or maybe they only have to be 12 inches apart. Right?
Yeah. I'll tell you, it drives us crazy in the jurisdictions. They're all different. Some jurisdictions require special seismic requirements, like San Jose. The spacing is a real tough one because most batteries have to be, even if it's UL listed for closer spacing, UL 9548, some jurisdictions ignore that. They used to accept it, now they don't. And now the batteries have to be 3 feet apart, and the batteries also have to be 3 feet away from a window or a door that's used to leave the building. So now let's say the batteries are 36 inches, 3 feet wide. So 2 batteries, that's 6 feet. And then spacing between them, that's 9 feet. And then 3 feet away from a window and door on either side, that's another 6 feet. So you need unobstructed wall space of almost 15 feet to put in 2 batteries. And then, this even happens sometimes that they say it has to be 15 feet away from the property line, even though the batteries don't make any noise. So it really becomes one of those things where the installer has to know exactly what the local rules are. And even when the rules are documented, sometimes they change. It drives us crazy.
Yeah. And I get it, right? And there's always, in our industry, and you've been around long enough to know this, there's always a significant event that causes a massive change in the way that we do things, right? Rapid shutdown, arc faults, battery systems, right? And so it can get ugly very quickly, right? And, people may not have 15, 20 feet of wall space to put a system up, right? But what I find funny is in my garage, I had a space carved out for my battery system. And like I had to take two big shelves out of the way for it to fit. So that if anything went wrong with my 20 kilowatt hour system, then I would be okay by the codes and standards. However, if I bought a Tesla with a 100 kilowatt hour battery, I could park that in the car behind me and nobody would say a word. And that's what kills me. It's like, okay, this 20 kilowatt little pea shooter system causes so much ruckus, but a 100 kilowatt hour EV is fine.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to get into the EV thing because that's a big opportunity going forward. Before we do that, what are the basic three options for installing a home battery system? And what are the alternatives? How can they be connected and sized? And just specifically, the way I'm looking at it is if you're using it just for arbitrage, if it's using it for essential loads and whole home backup. So step us through how those three types of applications would typically work.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. So every modern battery system, and that's just not the battery, that's the inverter, that's all the stuff that comes with it. They all have basically three operating modes that do three different things. And you're using the operating mode to kind of put it into another application, like you're saying rate arbitrage, right? And so rate arbitrage means basically you're buying power low and you're selling it high. You're actually selling it back to the utility. And this was unheard of 5-6 years ago. Like there were utilities that would not let you do that, even though the system was capable of doing so. But that's changed a lot, right? Matter of fact, arbitrage is a very common thing for commercial and utility scale applications. And you can even branch off that into virtual power plants and things like that, where the grid benefits from that excess energy, either from solar or from storage. For residential applications, there's usually a time of use, which you can also use for a rate arbitrage application. There's backup. And then there's another one that people may or may not be familiar with called self-consumption. And that one it's very popular in Europe. We don't really use it much here until people figure out what it does. They're like, oh man, this is actually pretty cool. And so the applications are, you could even get into, well, there's also a spinoff, if you want to, of off-grid, if you want to call that an application, and it is, which is why I specifically targeted the title of my book the way I did, because I did not. I love off-gridders. I love the preppers. I can tell immediately when they're in my classes, but that's just too much to put into a book. And then there's another one that even comes up lately where seriously people are talking about it, and that's grid defection, which basically would just be a virtual off-grid if your system is sized correctly, right? So we had these three main ones, and if you kind of look at what commercial and utility are looking at, it's always driven by money, right? It's always by money. And so the people that are doing virtual power plants and rate arbitrage with these big multi-megawatt hour, gigawatt hour systems, yeah, the end consumer may not get a whole lot of benefit from that, but they are definitely bumping the utility structure, right? Or at least it's saving money for them, regardless of whether or not those savings are passed on to the end user.
Yeah, I remember, heck, it was like 6 or 7 years ago, Enphase came out with their very first battery system. It was just a tiny little box, 2.5 kilowatt hours. And it was designed just to do arbitrage. A little box. It didn't do backup power. Didn't have a transfer switch in it. And, they did kind of finally come around pretty quickly. They realized that people wanted backup power. And so when I look at the systems providing backup power, you can back up essential loads. And let's talk a little bit about how big a battery that has to be and how many kilowatts you need, how big in terms of kilowatt hours, kilowatts. And then what would people need to back up a whole home, doing whole home backup, medium-sized home? I mean, how many kilowatt hours, how many batteries, how many kilowatt? What are some of the things you've seen out there in the field?
Oh boy, I've seen a lot of stuff, right? And so my answer to your question, if the question is how big, how many, how much, the answer is always, it depends. It always depends on so many things, yeah? And I mean, I've seen an 1,100 square foot house consume more power than a 4,000 square foot house.
It depends on what they're growing.
I think these guys were legit. It was just an old house in Texas, but you never know. You never know. But what it always boils down to is consumption, right? So it drives me crazy when you go to these sites and you're like, oh, how big of a battery? So, oh, and the first thing they ask you, how many square feet do you have? I'm like, oh gosh, that is so deceiving. But if you're looking at, generally speaking, right, I had a 20 kilowatt hour system. Okay. And if you just want to put a number on it, 1,800 square feet. Okay. 2-story. And I got a 5 kilowatt Sunny Boy inverter, and I had a 20 kilowatt sun and battery. Okay. 2 kids living at home, 4 people total. And with the 20 kilowatt hour system and with my PV system, I was invisible to SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District. I was invisible to them for about 5 months out of the year. But as soon as I turned that air conditioner on, all bets were off. And my electric dryer and my air conditioner were not on my essential load panel. I actually have an essential load panel. It has every breaker in my house except for my dryer and my air conditioner. So there was very little change to my quality of life when the grid went out. However, I know how to manage that. All right. So somebody in Arizona not having AC is not an option, okay, for whatever amount of time the grid is going to be out. So my 20 kilowatt hour system in Arizona, if I had a full battery, would probably only give me 3.5 hours of backup if the only thing I had running was that air conditioner. Okay. So it really depends. Like I said, it drives me crazy when somebody just does this. Oh, you got a 4-bedroom house? Yep, you need a 40 kilowatt hour. Like, dude, there's more than that.
So it really takes the designer, the installer, to kind of look at the bills and, even kind of dive into what the peak usage is. And it's really, really tricky to figure that out.
Yeah. And you know what? Time of use is actually the easiest of the modes to size for, right? Because it's on your utility bill. Like, it tells you between 5 and 9, you used this many kilowatt hours. Oh, holy smokes, man. That's freaking easy. I'll just multiply that out and there you go. There's my battery. But as soon as the grid goes down, that system flips to backup mode. And if you only size that system to take care of your time of use, you're in for a freaking surprise the first time the grid goes down and the rest of your house is on that battery system.
Yeah. No, it's tricky. So what kind of general advice would you have for homeowners that are shopping for a battery system?
I would definitely go with an installer that has a proven track record, just like anything, right? This is a huge investment, right? And I have found that people will do more research when they buy a car than they will when they're spending $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 on an energy storage system. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're using the right equipment, right? It's also, it makes you feel good if you have, a good warranty. But like I said, the number one thing that I would recommend to homeowners is to really ask the installer how they size this system, right? Because you have to make sure that you have enough solar to charge the system, right? And once you start adding things like EVs, it just gets so much more complicated, right? So I would really think about what you want specifically from your energy storage system, right? Do you just want to offset time of use? Do you want to have that peace of mind that comes with, having a refrigerator, having, your devices powered up, having your router on, being connected to the planet, and having a fridge full of cold beer and a freezer full of, brisket and having all these other things that, like you said before, are the bare minimum, is that worth having those things when the grid goes down? Because I hear a lot of times, I don't need backup. Yeah, you don't need it until you do. So those are the main things that I would talk to a homeowner about. And then there's just a whole laundry list of specifics that you could get into.
All right, we can get into those. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to break this up into 2 segments. So this wraps up the first segment with Greg Smith, and Greg's the author of The Battery Powered Home. And we've got another segment with Greg kind of going into some of the special features and things like vehicle to home and grid defection. We're going to talk about that in the second segment. So that's all the time we have on this week's show. Thanks, Greg, for joining me. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you miss any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.